Good evening. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger there is. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened at Gate 22 before Flight 341 to Nashville, and the name that stopped a gate agent cold. Melissa Hart had worked the gate podium at Denver International for 6 years, long enough to handle an overbooked flight with the same practiced calm she brought to everything else about the job. Flight 341 to Nashville was oversold by 4 seats that afternoon, a routine enough problem that she'd already begun the standard process, checking for volunteers willing to take a later flight in exchange for travel credit, working down the standby list in priority order, the same sequence she followed dozens of times a month without much thought. She'd made the boarding announcement twice already, offering compensation to anyone willing to give up their seat, and had secured 2 volunteers so far, leaving 2 seats still needed before the flight could close out on schedule. She pulled up the standby list on her screen, scanning down the names in priority order, most of them unremarkable to her, names attached to loyalty tier levels and connection deadlines, the ordinary math of who got seats and who didn't on a full flight. The 4th name on the list stopped her scrolling entirely. Vance, Elijah, standby, priority 4. Melissa stared at the screen for a long moment, her hand hovering over the keyboard, a name she'd heard spoken at her family's dinner table more times than she could count over the last 4 years, though she'd never once expected to see it appear on a screen in front of her at work. She glanced at the passenger's date of birth listed beside the name, then at the military ID flag attached to his booking record, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with the ordinary stress of an overbooked flight. She'd grown up hearing her brother Danny tell the story of Corporal Elijah Vance more times than she could count. The ambush outside a forward base in Kandahar province. The 20 minutes Elijah had spent under fire, dragging her wounded brother to cover and keeping pressure on a wound that would have killed him without exactly that kind of steady, desperate effort. The medevac that finally arrived because Elijah had refused to stop working on him even as the fighting continued around them both. Danny had survived. Elijah had been reassigned to another unit within weeks, and the 2 men had lost touch the way deployments sometimes scattered friendships before they had the chance to fully form. Danny had spent years trying, unsuccessfully, to track him down, wanting nothing more than the chance to properly thank the man who'd saved his life. Melissa remembered the first time Danny had told the story in full, years after his discharge, sitting at their parents' kitchen table with a beer he'd barely touched, his voice cracking in places he usually kept carefully controlled. He'd described Elijah's hands, steady even as everything around them fell apart, the way he'd talked to Danny the entire time to keep him conscious, promising him he wasn't going to die on that ground, no matter what it took. Danny had cried telling it, something Melissa had rarely seen from her brother before or since, and she'd promised herself quietly that if she ever had the chance to find that man, she would. And now, his name was sitting on Melissa's standby list, 4 seats short of a boarding pass. Melissa scanned the gate area, searching the small crowd of waiting standby passengers until she found him. A lean man in his early 30s, sitting quietly near the window with a duffel bag between his feet, watching the tarmac with the particular stillness she'd heard her brother describe more than once. She approached him carefully, uncertain how to even begin the conversation forming in her mind. "Excuse me, are you Elijah Vance?" He looked up, mild surprise crossing his face at being addressed by name rather than a boarding group number. "Yes, ma'am, that's me. I'm Melissa Hart," she said, her voice unsteady in a way that surprised even her. "My brother is Danny Hart. He served with you in Kandahar." Elijah's expression shifted immediately, recognition and something more complicated moving across his face. "Danny Hart, is he?" He paused, clearly bracing for news he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "He's alive," Melissa said quickly. "He's alive because of you. He's told that story more times than I can count. He spent years trying to find you to say thank you properly." Elijah sat with that for a long moment, visibly moved, the professional composure of a man used to keeping his emotions contained, slipping just slightly at the podium of a crowded gate. "I think about that day more than people probably assume," he said quietly. "Didn't know if he made it. Lost track of everybody from that unit not long after." "He made it," Melissa said. "He's got 2 kids now. Neither of them would exist without what you did that day." The conversation might have continued longer, except Elijah glanced past her toward the departure board, his expression shifting into something more urgent. "Ma'am, I don't mean to cut this short, but I really need to get on this flight. My mother's in hospice in Nashville. The doctors don't think she has more than a day or 2 left, and I've been trying to get there for 3 days now. Bumped off 2 flights already." Melissa's stomach dropped. "Your standby, priority 4. We only had 2 seats open up so far." "I understand," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the visible strain beneath it. I'm not asking for special treatment. I just needed you to know why I'm pushing so hard to get on this one. Melissa returned to her podium, her mind racing through every procedural option available to her, none of which offered an easy answer. Standby priority was strict for good reason, designed to prevent exactly the kind of favoritism she now desperately wanted to extend, and overriding it without cause would violate the fairness the entire system depended on for every other passenger waiting in that line. But this wasn't favoritism, not really. This was a man with 2 days left to reach his dying mother, a man who'd once spent 20 minutes under fire keeping her own brother alive, standing 4 seats short of a flight that could make the difference between arriving in time and arriving too late. She keyed her radio, requesting her shift supervisor, a woman named Patrice Okafor, to the gate. "I've got a situation," Melissa said once Patrice arrived. "Standby passenger, priority 4, needs to reach Nashville for an end-of-life family situation. I know the priority order exists for a reason, but I'm asking if there's any flexibility here." Patrice reviewed the standby list, then the passenger's booking notes, her expression softening slightly at the documented hospice details Elijah had already provided when he'd first tried to book emergency travel 3 days earlier. "This is legitimate. We do have a compassionate travel protocol for exactly this kind of circumstance, but it requires supervisor approval and documentation, which he's already provided in his original booking attempt." "Can we use it?" Melissa asked. "We can review it," Patrice said, "but it still doesn't solve the seat math. We need 4 seats, and we've only secured 2 volunteers so far." Melissa made a decision in that moment that went beyond simple procedure. She stepped back to the gate microphone, her voice carrying clearly across the waiting area. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be honest with you about our situation today. We have a passenger on our standby list who's trying to reach his dying mother in Nashville. He served our country, and years ago, he personally saved the life of a soldier who happens to be my own brother. We need 2 more volunteers to give up their seats for a later flight, with full compensation, to make sure he makes it home in time." The gate area fell quiet for a moment, passengers glancing at each other, the ordinary irritation of a delayed or bumped flight suddenly recontextualized by what Melissa had just shared. A middle-aged man near the front, dressed for a business trip, raised his hand first. "I can take a later flight," he said. "My meeting's not until tomorrow morning anyway. I've got some flexibility." A young couple traveling together exchanged a quick glance before the woman spoke up as well. "We can give up one of our seats too. We were just headed to Nashville for a weekend trip. Nothing urgent." Melissa felt something loosen in her chest as the count climbed toward what she needed, genuine gratitude mixing with disbelief at how quickly strangers had stepped forward once they understood what was actually at stake. She processed the volunteers quickly, working with Patrice to finalize the compassionate travel exception for Elijah, ensuring his boarding pass printed with time to spare before the flight's scheduled departure. Elijah, watching the sequence unfold from his seat near the window, approached the podium once his name was called, visibly overwhelmed by what had just happened around him. "I don't know what to say," he told Melissa. "I wasn't expecting any of this." "You don't need to say anything," Melissa said, handing him his boarding pass, her hands not quite steady. "You already did the thing that mattered, years ago, for someone I love. This is just us catching up on the debt." Elijah studied the boarding pass for a moment, then looked back at her, something shifting in his expression. "Your brother, Danny, is there any chance I could get his number? I'd like to actually talk to him, if he's willing." "He's been trying to find you for years," Melissa said, already pulling out her phone. "I'll send you his number right now. He's not going to believe this." Elijah boarded Flight 341 with 15 minutes to spare before departure, settling into a middle seat that had opened up among the volunteers, his duffel bag tucked beneath the seat ahead of him. He spent much of the flight staring out at the clouds, his mind cycling between the mother he was racing to reach and the unexpected, overwhelming reunion of a name he'd carried with quiet guilt for years, uncertain whether the soldier he'd once bled beside had even survived the encounter that had scattered them both into different units. Somewhere over Kansas, his phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number, one word attached before a longer message followed. "Elijah?" He typed back with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Danny, your sister found me on a standby list of all things. I've thought about you more times than you'd probably believe." The messages that followed over the next hour, exchanged in fragments as the flight allowed, carried 4 years of unspoken gratitude and unresolved questions between 2 men who had once depended on each other for their lives and then lost each other to the ordinary chaos of military reassignment. Danny thanked him plainly, repeatedly, unable to fully articulate what 4 more years of life had meant to him, years that included a wedding, 2 children, a career, none of which would exist without the 20 minutes Elijah had spent refusing to let him die. "I never stopped looking for you," Danny wrote. "Wanted you to know that. I never stopped thinking about that day either," Elijah replied. "Glad it wasn't for nothing." The flight landed in Nashville on schedule, and Elijah moved through the terminal with the same urgency that had carried him through 3 days of canceled and bumped flights, catching a cab directly to the hospice facility where his mother had been holding on, according to the last update from his sister, longer than the doctors had expected. Elijah arrived at the hospice facility just after 7 that evening, finding his mother conscious, weak, but aware, his sister seated beside her bed, having kept a near constant vigil for the last several days. His mother's eyes found his the moment he entered the room, and something in her face eased visibly at the sight of him, as though she'd been holding on specifically for this. "You made it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wouldn't have missed it," Elijah said, taking her hand, sitting close enough that she didn't have to strain to see him clearly. "Almost didn't, though. Flight was overbooked. A gate agent went out of her way to get me on it." He spent the next several hours by her bedside, and she passed peacefully 2 days later, with both of her children present. A timeline that would have unfolded very differently if Melissa Hart hadn't recognized a name on a standby list and decided, against strict procedure, that some debts were worth bending the rules for. Danny flew to Nashville himself once he heard the news, not for the funeral timeline directly, but to finally meet Elijah in person, the 2 men embracing at the airport with the particular weight of people who'd once depended entirely on each other and never expected the chance to properly close that circle. Melissa joined them the following week, having taken a personal day specifically to make the trip, meeting the man whose name had lived at her family's dinner table for 4 years without a face attached to it. "I still can't believe it was you," Melissa said, shaking Elijah's hand for the second time, this time under far less hurried circumstances. 4 seats short, and there you were on my screen. "I still can't believe you recognized my name at all," Elijah said. "Most people wouldn't have looked twice at a standby list. Most people don't grow up hearing a story like yours told at every family dinner for 4 years, Melissa said. "I'd have known that name anywhere." Danny, standing beside them, put a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You gave me years I wasn't supposed to get. My sister just made sure you got where you needed to be when it mattered most. Feels like something finally came full circle." Elijah looked between the 2 of them, something in his posture settling in a way it hadn't in years. "Feels that way to me too. I've flown passengers who never said a single word to the person beside them, and I've watched a name on a standby list turn a routine overbooking into something that mattered more than any of us at that gate expected. At 35,000 feet, or standing at a crowded podium with 4 seats too few, the debts we owe each other have a way of finding us again when we least expect it. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to look twice at a name on a screen." If this story moved you, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next flight.